Montana wilderness unfurls like a vast, untamed canvas, its edges frayed by jagged peaks and dense forests of pine and fir that stretch toward a sky often cloaked in gray. The air here is sharp and clean, carrying the scent of resin, damp earth, and the faint musk of unseen creatures, a perfume that seeps into the lungs and promises solitude. A solitude that can cradle or crush, depending on the hour and the slant of the light. Beneath the towering trees, the ground is a tapestry of needles, moss, and stone, softening footsteps into whispers that barely disturb the stillness, while creeks carve quiet veins through the undergrowth, their waters dark and cold, reflecting a world that feels both ancient and indifferent. This is a land shaped by eons, its contours worn by the tread of trappers, miners, and those who sought refuge from civilization's clamor, yet untouched in its deeper reaches, where the woods fold into hollows too old to name. For those who crave escape, men and women fleeing the grind of cities, the weight of expectation, these forests offer a sanctuary as alluring as it is merciless. Cabins rise from the earth, rough-hewn from the surrounding timber, their walls weathered by decades of frost and wind, promising shelter from a world that never slows. But the wilderness has a way of turning shelter into a cage, of twisting silence into a scream, of bending the mind until it fractures under the weight of its own shadows. What begins as a life of simplicity can unravel into something darker, something that leaves behind tracks too deep, wounds too raw, and a presence that lingers like a stain on the soul. This is the story of Lyle Hemsworth, a man who fled to the backwoods of Montana a decade ago, building a life of solitude that shattered one crisp autumn day in an encounter that left evidence. Tangible, undeniable, and haunting, etched into the earth and his memory. The refuge, a life carved from silence. Lyle Hemsworth was a man who wore solitude like a second skin, a figure in his late 30s whose lean frame and weathered hands spoke of a life wrested from the wild. His eyes, a faded green shadowed by years of squinting into the sun, held a quiet resolve, a determination to carve out a space where the world's noise couldn't reach. 10 years ago, he turned his back on the city, Billings with its concrete sprawl and ceaseless hum, leaving behind a job as a civil engineer that had begun to feel like a noose tightening around his neck. The chaos of schedules, the press of crowds, the endless rules, they'd never suited him. So he sold what little he owned, bought a patch of land deep in the Montana backwoods, and built a cabin with his own hands, felling pines from the surrounding forest, their sap sticking to his palms as he shaped them into walls that stood sturdy against the wind. It was a simple place. One room with a tin roof, a wood stove that doubled as a cooktop, a small shed out back for tools and a generator he rarely used. No electricity ran through its veins, no pipes brought water from the earth. Just a well he'd dug himself, its bucket creaking with every haul, and a shortwave radio he fired up now and then to catch the weather or a voice to remind him the world still turned beyond the trees. The nearest town, a 2-hour drive down a dirt track that turned to mud in the rain, was a speck of civilization he visited only when necessity demanded. Once a month, maybe, for ammo, salt, or a bottle of whiskey to cut the chill. Out here, he answered to no one. He hunted deer and elk with a rifle slung over his shoulder, fished the creeks for trout with a line he'd braided himself, and read by the flickering light of a lantern, old paperbacks yellowing on a shelf he'd nailed to the wall. It wasn't an easy life. The winters were brutal, snow piling against the cabin until it groaned. The summers thick with mosquitoes that bit through flannel. But it was honest, and it was his. His only companion was Rufus, a wiry mutt with a coat the color of damp earth, whose boundless energy chased squirrels through the underbrush and whose low growl warned of foxes sniffing too close to the traps. They'd settled into a rhythm, Lyle and Rufus, a partnership forged in the quiet of the wild, where words were few and trust was everything. That autumn morning began like any other, the sun rising slow and pale over Granite Peak, casting long shadows through the pines that stretched like fingers across the frost-kissed ground. The air was crisp, biting at Lyle's fingertips as he stepped onto the porch, his breath clouding in the dawn light. He stoked the wood stove, the crackle of kindling a familiar hymn, and brewed a pot of coffee in a dented tin pot, its bitter steam curling into the air. Rufus bounded ahead as Lyle slung his rifle over his shoulder, deciding to check the traps he'd set along the creek a mile north. Simple snares of wire and wood, baited with scraps to catch rabbits or the occasional fox. The forest hummed with life as they walked, birds chattering in the canopy, the rustle of small creatures darting through the underbrush, the creek's gurgle a steady pulse beneath it all. Rufus was in high spirits, nose to the ground, tail wagging like a metronome as he sniffed every tree and chased after squirrels he'd never catch. Lyle's boots crunched over pine needles, the weight of the rifle a comfort against his back, the solitude a balm to his soul. It was a morning like any other, until it wasn't. The woods, a silence that bites. The creek glittered under the morning sun, its waters cold and clear, winding through a thicket of pines that stood like sentinels against the sky. Lyle knelt by the first trap, pleased to find a rabbit snared, its fur matted with dew, then a fox in the next, its amber eyes glassy in death. A decent haul, enough for a few days' meals and a pelt to trade. He reset the snares with practiced hands, wire biting into his calluses, when Rufus stiffened beside him, a low growl rumbling from his throat. Not the playful bark of their wrestling matches, but a deep, wary sound that made Lyle's skin prickle. "What's got into you, boy?" he muttered, straightening, his eyes sweeping the dense thicket across the creek. The forest stretched out in an endless sea of green and shadow, the pines towering overhead, their branches knitting a ceiling that dimmed the light to a muted glow. Nothing moved, nothing stirred, just trees and silence, the kind that presses against the ears like a weight. He whistled for Rufus to settle, figuring it was a raccoon or a bobcat lurking out of sight, but the dog didn't budge, his hackles raised, eyes fixed on the dark beyond the water. Then Lyle heard it. A faint rustling, heavier than the scamper of small feet, deliberate, like something big moving slow through the brush. His hand tightened on the rifle, the wood smooth against his palm, and he called out, "Who's there?" His voice cut through the stillness, sharp and hollow, swallowed by the trees. Silence answered, but it wasn't empty. The forest seemed to hush, birds falling quiet, the air thickening as if everything held its breath. Rufus whined, stepping back, and Lyle's heart kicked up a notch, though he told himself it was just a deer, a buck spooked by their presence. But then came the smell, foul, like rotten meat left to fester in the sun, strong enough to make him gag, his stomach lurching as he pressed a sleeve to his nose. "Come on, Rufus, let's go," he said, voice steady despite the unease coiling in his gut. They turned back toward the cabin, the creek's gurgle fading behind them, but the feeling lingered, a prickle at the nape of his neck, a sense that eyes followed their every step. The walk back was tense, every snap of a twig or crunch of leaves jolting Lyle's nerves, his head swiveling to scan the shadows over his shoulder. Nothing, just trees and the wind, rustling through the pines like a whisper he couldn't decipher. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun hung high, its light spilling across the clearing, the familiar sight of the weathered logs easing the knot in his chest. He busied himself skinning the rabbits and prepping the fox, the rhythm of the knife against flesh grounding him, Rufus curling up on the porch with a sigh. Mid-afternoon, he decided to chop wood. Winter was coming, and you could never have too much firewood. The axe bit into a hefty log, the crack of splitting timber echoing through the trees, when he noticed Rufus was gone. The dog usually lazed nearby, chasing his tail or gnawing a stick, but the porch was empty, the clearing silent. "Rufus," Lyle called, setting the axe down, his voice carrying into the woods. No bark, no scamper of paws, just stillness, a knot forming in his stomach like a stone sinking into deep water. He circled the cabin, expecting to find Rufus digging holes or harassing a chipmunk, but the dog was nowhere in sight. "Rufus, come here, boy," he shouted, louder now, the silence pressing back like a wall. Panic clawed at him, sharp and unfamiliar. He didn't scare easy, not after a decade out here, but Rufus was his shadow, his tether. Grabbing the rifle, he headed toward the creek, thinking the dog might have picked up a scent and wandered back. The woods thickened around him, pines looming taller, their shadows stretching long and thin as the sun dipped lower. That putrid smell hit him again, stronger now, flies buzzing in the air like a dark cloud, the weight of it pressing against his lungs. He pushed through a thicket of bushes, branches snapping under his boots, and stopped dead in his tracks. There, in a small clearing, lay Rufus, limp, motionless, his body torn open with gashes too deep, too precise to be from any bear or cougar Lyle knew. Blood soaked the earth, still warm under his trembling hands as he dropped to his knees beside the dog, a mix of sorrow and rage surging through him like a wildfire. He scanned the clearing, every sense razor-sharp, the forest eerily quiet. No birds, no wind, just the hum of flies and the stench of death. Then he saw it, a figure standing 50 yards away, between the trees, tall and impossibly thin, covered in matted hair that hung like a shroud. Its eyes struck him hardest, deep-set, dark, reflecting a glint of light that shouldn't have been there, piercing the gloom with a hunger that turned his blood to ice. "Stay back!" Lyle roared, raising the rifle, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. The figure tilted its head, almost curious, then let out a low, guttural sound that resonated in his chest, a vibration that shook his bones. Before he could pull the trigger, it moved, disappearing behind the trees with a speed that defied reason, branches snapping in its wake. Adrenaline flooded him. He fired a shot in its direction, the crack of the rifle shattering the silence, echoing through the woods. He didn't know if he'd hit it, didn't care. He sprinted back toward the cabin, branches whipping his face, his mind a tangle of fear and disbelief. What the hell was that thing? The siege, a cabin's fragile stand. Bursting through the cabin door, Lyle slammed it shut, the bolt sliding home with a hollow clank. His breath came in ragged gasps, sweat dripping down his forehead as he leaned against the wood, the rifle trembling in his grip. 3 rounds left. Not enough. He crossed to the closet, yanking out the shotgun, its weight a cold comfort as he loaded it with shells, the click of metal a lifeline in the chaos. Minutes stretched into hours as he stood by the window, peering through a gap in the curtains, the daylight fading to a dim, bruised purple, shadows lengthening across the clearing like fingers clawing at the earth. The forest, his sanctuary for a decade, now loomed as a threat, its silence a predator's crouch. Movement flickered at the clearing's edge. The figure emerged again, its form clearer in the dying light. It stood on 2 legs, limbs elongated and disproportionate, patches of gray, leathery skin visible through tangled hair that swayed like dead vines. It moved toward the cabin with a slow, deliberate gait, each step a thud against the earth, its eyes locked on the windows as if it could see through the walls. Lyle threw open the sash, the shotgun's barrel steady as he fired. A blast that tore through the evening, the recoil jarring his shoulder. The creature recoiled, a shudder rippling through its frame, but it didn't fall. Instead, it let out a piercing scream that made his blood run cold, a sound that clawed at his ears and burrowed into his skull. It broke into a run, closing the distance with terrifying speed, and slammed against the cabin walls, the logs groaning under the impact, dust sifting from the ceiling. He fired again, the shot grazing its side, black blood oozing from the wound as it snarled, undeterred. The window shattered inward, glass spraying across the floor, an arm reaching through, clawed fingers grasping at the air, long and bony, the skin stretched tight like parchment. Lyle grabbed the fireplace poker, a sturdy rod of iron, and swung with all his might, striking the limb. A howl of pain erupted, the arm retracting, but the creature pounded the door. Each hit a thunderclap that shook the frame, the hinges creaking as they began to give. Desperate, he remembered the flare gun in his emergency kit, a battered tin box under the bed. He snatched it up just as the door burst open, splintering inward, the figure filling the doorway, its eyes black pools of malice fixed on him. Without hesitation, Lyle aimed and fired. The flare struck its chest, erupting in a burst of bright, burning light, flames licking across its matted hair and leathery skin. The creature stumbled backward, shrieking, its thrashing knocking over the table as fire consumed it, the smell of burning flesh overwhelming, acrid and thick. Seizing the moment, he charged forward with the poker, driving it into the creature's midsection, the iron sinking deep. It wailed, knocking him to the ground, his shoulder slamming into the floorboards with a crack of pain. He scrambled back as it writhed, the flames spreading, its movements growing erratic until, with one last agonized cry, it collapsed into a smoldering heap. Lyle didn't wait to see if it was truly dead. He gathered what he could: backpack, food, ammo, the shotgun, and sprinted to his truck behind the cabin, the keys already in his hand from habit. The engine roared to life, gravel spitting under the tires as he tore down the dirt path, smoke rising from the cabin in the rearview mirror, a pang of loss twisting in his chest beneath the flood of relief. Survival was all that mattered now. Headlights appeared ahead. A pickup truck, its driver a middle-aged man with a weathered face who rolled down his window as Lyle flagged him down. "What's the hurry, friend?" the man asked, eyeing him skeptically. "There's something out there," Lyle said, voice steady despite the tremor in his limbs. "Something dangerous." The man nodded, noticing the blood and soot on Lyle's jacket. "Hop in, let's get to town." Lyle followed, keeping close, the drive a blur of trees and darkness until they reached the sheriff's office. The evidence, a truth too deep to bury. He told the sheriff everything. The tracks too large for any known beast, the stench of rot, Rufus's torn body, the creature's impossible form, the fight that left his cabin scarred and smoking. They looked at him like he was unhinged, a man broken by isolation. But when a search party went out the next day, they found the remains. The cabin's shattered door, the charred carcass of something the authorities couldn't identify, its bones twisted and blackened, too tall, too strange to be human or animal. Experts were called in, biologists, anthropologists, but no answers came, only shrugs and muttered theories about mutations or hoaxes. The sheriff filed it as an unexplained incident, the report gathering dust in a drawer, but Lyle knew the truth. Something ancient, something malevolent, stalked those woods, its presence etched into the earth. Deep gashes in the trees, the shed's wreckage, a tuft of iridescent hair he'd found near the creek, glinting under lantern light like no creature he'd ever known. The evidence lingers. A flare's burn mark on the cabin floor, the poker bent from impact, the silence that swallowed Amos's cabin, his body erased as if it never was. The Montana wilderness holds its secrets tight, in the hollows beneath the pines, where the wind whispers of things older than memory. Lyle left it all behind, heading east, but the dreams follow. Those glowing eyes, that guttural scream, a grin he never saw but feels in his marrow. Reader, could you live alone in those woods, trusting the silence to hold? Or would the first rustle beyond the trees drive you back to the light? Would you face the hollow's truth, or flee from what watches when the world goes still? The forbidden excavation unearths this tale, daring you to peer into the shadows where Lyle's nightmare waits.